possible.
I'm Tori Bedford. Tonight on Greater Boston, it's the last chance for voters to make their voices heard as Election Day comes to an end. We'll take one last look at the candidates and races you need to know before the votes are tallied. Then, many of the people in Massachusetts' maximum security prison are released without any support from the state, something local activists call a recipe for failure. In less than an hour, polls will close for local elections all across Massachusetts, with candidates in different cities and towns running for mayor, city council, and one special election for state senate. And of course, here in Boston, voters are choosing at least 4 new city councilors, with 10-term incumbent Michael Flaherty and 6-term incumbent Frank Baker stepping down in the preliminary defeats of Kendra Lara and Ricardo Arroyo. So what races should we be looking out for once the results start coming in? Helping me break it down is GBH News reporter and Talking Politics host Adam Reilly. Adam, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Tori. Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Hey, so there's a lot going on, and you've been covering all of it. What are some of the kind of key races? Let's start in Boston. What are some kind of key races that you've been watching, and just tell us about what you're seeing?
Well, as you mentioned, there's the at-large race and the district races for people to keep an eye on. I'm always fascinated by the at-large contest because, as many of our viewers will know, Boston has 13 city councilors, 9 represent particular parts of the city, and 4 run citywide, represent the entire city. As such, they have a little more, I think, political clout than their district colleagues. And the at-large seat, if you top the ticket in the at-large race, it tends to be a harbinger of big things to come. Michelle Wu topped the ticket a couple times before she became mayor. Ayanna Pressley topped the ticket a couple of times before she became a congresswoman. So simply for that reason, it's interesting to see who comes out on top in the at-large contest. In this particular race, with Michael Flaherty leaving, as you mentioned, former mayoral candidate and longtime city councilor Michael Flaherty, there's a pretty stark difference between the 2 people running to replace him. Henry Santana, I shouldn't say the 2 people, the 2 favorites running to replace him. Henry Santana is an alum of the Wu administration, a progressive in the Wu mold who's being backed by his former boss, not as far to the left as people like Ricardo Arroyo or Kendra Lara, but to the left. And then Bridget Nee Walsh, who's an iron worker from Southie, calls herself right of center, but open-minded. So there's been this divide on the council, very sharp divide for the past few months between progressives and moderates who might skew conservative. And the at-large contest is going to, I think, help determine the balance of power there. I should let you get a word in edgewise, by the way, because I can just keep on rambling for about 8 minutes.
Yeah, you're a host. You're used to this. I'm just letting you go.
Right.
You actually, when you were hosting Talking Politics, I think you had Yawu Miller on from the Bay State Banner. And he said that he, looking at this race, feels that the city council is going to become less progressive based on what he's seeing in this race. What do you think about that?
You know, talking about the entire race, we've got the at-large contest, and then we've got a bunch of district contests. As you mentioned, there's Frank Baker, who's probably the most vocal conservative on the body. He's leaving after having been there a while. Kendra Lara and Ricardo Arroyo did not make it through to the final. I don't agree with Yawu that the body is necessarily going to become more conservative, because if you take those district races, for example, each of those has a progressive running who I think ideologically would be at least somewhat similar to where the outgoing incumbent was. And then there's a more moderate candidate. So depending on how it shakes out, the council could become less progressive, or it could stay roughly the same. I think what might happen, Ricardo Arroyo and Kendra Lara both had a tendency to try to pull Mayor Wu to the left. And in those contests, those district contests, the progressives are people who've been backed by Mayor Wu. So what I think you might have is a council that isn't necessarily less progressive, but maybe less inclined to make the mayor's life difficult.
Yeah, I wonder about that in terms of the council's role in challenging the mayor. You'd mentioned Mayor Wu. I also wanted to talk about former Mayor Marty Walsh. There's a lot of big endorsements happening in Boston in this race. Can you talk about that?
There are. He has endorsed one of the candidates, John Fitzgerald, who's running to replace Frank Baker. Joel Richards is the other candidate in that district contest. Walsh has also endorsed Jose Ruiz. He's a former Boston police officer who's running for the seat that Ricardo Arroyo currently holds. Ruiz is running against Enrique Pepin, who's been endorsed by his former boss, Mayor Wu. So that creates this interesting dynamic where you've got the current mayor and the past mayor engaged in a proxy fight of sorts. I don't know how much it matters in terms of big picture stakes, but it will be interesting to see who wins that one, which of them in that particular contest at this particular moment has more muscle.
And there have been some other endorsements in races across the state as well. I know Governor Healey has endorsed a couple of candidates.
Oh, Governor Healey and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll have endorsed a ton of mayoral candidates. So that is, I guess, a meta theme that's going to be interesting to watch in this race, the success that they have or don't have when it comes to putting their preferred governing partners into office. I have a bad tendency, I think a lot of us in the political media do, to extract too much meaning from the way, say, one election shakes out. And we'll see how they do, see how the Healey-Driscoll administration does when it comes to getting people they want in office into office. And then I'll try not to draw overly hasty or dramatic conclusions.
What are the most interesting races that you're watching of those mayoral races across the state? What has kind of struck you as really potentially changing the game? I'm
fascinated by the mayoral race in Revere. I don't know. Are you a Revere Beach goer?
Oh, yeah.
Did you make it out there? Okay.
I defended against my friends who grew up here and would never go there. So, yes, I am.
You know that in the past few years, there's just been this crazy amount of new construction on Revere Beach. It's almost like what we've seen in the Seaport, where if you were last there 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, you just wouldn't recognize it right now. In the Revere mayoral race, the acting mayor, Patrick Keefe, is trying to keep that job, trying to remain as mayor. He's running against a former mayor named Dan Rizzo. And Rizzo, one of the arguments that he's making is that Revere has just been building too much, that there's way too much new housing, that it's causing a drain on city services, schools, that sort of thing, creating traffic. And he has said that if he wins, he'd push for an immediate moratorium on new apartment construction. It's just one community which has had a certain kind of building going on over the past few years, but because there's such interest in Massachusetts statewide in ramping up construction of new homes to deal with the housing shortage, this is a really interesting case study in how the politics of that issue can play out, again, in just one particular community.
And it's an interesting problem to have as well, because that's not the case in most cities and towns across the state.
You're right. It's not the case. It's the opposite. They're not building, but Revere has been building a lot of new apartments. They're right on the shore. They're targeted toward younger residents. They're to rent rather than to own. A lot of apartments targeted to younger pet owners, which is sort of interesting. So yeah, it is. It's not representative of the entire state, but it's an insight, or will give us some insight into an issue the whole state's grappling with.
Just quickly to touch on something our colleague Katie Lannon has been covering, the special election out in Worcester County.
It's in the
Worcester Hampshire district.
No, Worcester Hampshire Senate district, and it's a chance for the Massachusetts Republican Party, which has sort of been at an all-time low in terms of influence. It's a chance for them to pick up a Senate seat. Peter Durant, their nominee, is running against Jonathan Zlotnick, the Democrat. It's a seat that was vacated by Ann Goby, who left to join the Healey administration. And again, it's just one seat, but the Republicans right now have 3 of 40 Senate seats in the state legislature. You can't do very much with that. So if they're able to pull out a win there, it will let Amy Carnevale, who's the new chair of the Mass Republican Party, it'll let her take a victory lap and say, hey, we've had a tough couple of years, but we're headed in the right direction. I don't know if it will give them momentum, but she will make the argument that it has given them momentum for more elections that are coming up down the road.
It's a big day for a lot of municipal races. I wonder if you're seeing excitement or engagement from a lot of people, from voters. It's not necessarily the Boston mayoral race, but are you seeing a lot of investment from people?
That's a really tough. It's a tough thing to gauge, right? Because you can see what looks like a tremendous amount of enthusiasm online, for example, for those of us who still spend too much time on the website formerly known as Twitter. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with enthusiasm in real life. But there are just one possible metric. There are a bunch of mayors, incumbent mayors, who do look to be vulnerable. So I think that vulnerability, based on what happened in the preliminary election in September, that alone suggests, I think, a notable measure of civic engagement and interest, which we don't always see.
Right. What do you think would be maybe the biggest shift out of all of this? Or something that you're just obsessed with? Some element of this that you're like, oh my gosh. It sounds like the Senate race out in the Worcester, Hampshire district is something we'll watch.
Yeah, I mean, but that wouldn't necessarily connote a seismic shift. To go back to Boston, which is the community that I've been following most closely and am most interested in, if in fact Yahoo Miller, formerly the Bay State Banner, is right, and if in fact Boston voters elect a bunch of centrist candidates to replace outgoing progressives or outgoing centrists and conservatives, I think that'd be notable. I don't know that I expect that it's going to happen, but the question of whether the Boston City Council remains this staunchly progressive body or whether it tacks to the center, there I do think we'll get an actual accurate look at sort of the pulse of one community, politically speaking.
Great. Adam Reilly, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your coverage.
Good to see you, Tori.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Next up, nearly 300 people are released from maximum security prison every year in Massachusetts, and many of them go straight from their cell to the street. Without any help from the state as they re-enter society, many of them will end up right back in prison. In fact, 40% of all maximum security prisoners are reincarcerated within 3 years of their release. It's a process that some prisoners and activists see as a recipe for failure.
The statistics speak for itself. Like, everybody goes back in. All the trauma now that I'm going through, I feel like it's just, I know I got a lot to lose now. It's even more.
Jamal Vital was recently released after 2 years at Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, the state's maximum security prison in Lancaster. He shared his story with GBH News Deputy Investigations Editor Jenifer McKim, who joins me now, along with Mac Hudson, a community liaison coordinator and reentry consultant for the Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Hi, Tori.
So Jamal Vital, can you just give a little overview of kind of his experience? You worked with him on this story, and you've worked with him for a while, and you've been advocating for him. Can you just talk a little bit about what he's experienced?
So Mac introduced me to Jamal, and because I wanted to do this story, that I'd heard that there was this large percentage of people who are being released directly from maximum security prison to the street without sort of the traditional step-down programs that you can have in a minimum or pre-release program, working outside, getting outside. Basically, he spent nearly 2.5 years in maximum security prison at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, like locked in his cell before he was released, sent out basically in chains, wearing his prison-issued shoes, and released to the street without sort of the things that would help him succeed when he was being released.
Yeah, and you've been focusing, too, as part of this series about reentry. You know, what happens to people when they are released and they have nothing and no kind of step down, right? Because I can imagine it's really jarring.
Yeah, so this is part of our ongoing series called Life After Prison, where we're looking at folks who are being released from prisons, all of the prisons in Massachusetts. And this particular statistic just really stuck out to me, that people were being released like that. And Matt can talk a lot more about it as a formerly incarcerated person, but anywhere you leave a prison, it's hard to have that transition, and there's not enough programming and not enough help for people who are being released. But people being released from maximum security, where most of them are in there for 20 hours a day in their cell, unable to really do things that will help them when they come out, just makes it a lot harder to succeed, to find work, to do things, when it affects your mind in lots of ways.
Yeah, Matt, can you talk about that? Just that, you know, you're going from being almost like this classification of civilian that is stripped of all your rights, and then upon release, you know, how do you look at the options ahead of you? What does that look like?
Well, truth, there really isn't. I don't think most people, when they get out, they're really thinking that far. They're just happy to get out in that moment and second. But then once they're out, the reality sinks in that now that they really have to now do what it takes to survive. And if you've been locked up in a cage for the majority of your time, well, what does survival look like for you? you know? And I think that that's what's missing. A lot of folks look at, or they have this great debate about the conditions of what the condition should be, what it isn't be. Well, there's entitlements that every Massachusetts prisoner has. And that entitlement is to make sure that they have program access, reentry access, and a step-down process. And that's what fundamentally is being deprived here. Those step-down process in order to justify and rationalize bed space that otherwise would be empty in the maximum security I'm speaking, right? So when you're using the classification process in that manner, right, that deprives folks to go down in lower security, they could never make it down to a minimum or a pre-release.
Well, I want to stop you there because that's a big part of the story that I think is worth stopping to kind of explain is the classification process, right? So there is a system, and you spoke to state officials, prison officials who've said, like, people will be eventually stepped down to lower security. That's where they're given these resources within this system, right? Or they're moved into a different part of Sousa. But that's not what happened to Jamal, and it sounds like it's not what happens to a lot of people. So what is that? How does that work, or not work, I guess, in this case? Well,
it doesn't work, period. That's the problem. So you have a lot of folks that are getting out in various different securities. And maximum security is a lot of folks getting out that are short-termers, but they've been up there 4 or 5 years under those types of conditions. Those conditions are abnormal, right? To be locked up 21, 22 hours in some cases, an hour a day in your cell, and not having no one to really converse with, and then you come out for those little small periods of time. Well, how does someone orientate to now the world is moving that fast, right? Where you have to now take responsibility in a way that you've been deprived responsibility while you've been there. So the whole point of the classification process is that as you step down, you gain greater autonomy of yourself. When you're in the maximum security, it's because you're saying, or they at least believe, that you have to be watched. When you're in the medium security, it's because now they're saying you can observe the rules.
And the classification is basically you're now classified as, less dangerous or whatever, and that's when you get those resources, but you're not given the same resources. And so that process, it isn't happening, though, for people. Is that legal?
So let me dispel one thing. Programs, services are supposed to be at every facility, whether you're in maximum, minimum, medium, it doesn't matter. They have an obligation to run those programs, but they don't run them in the maximum security prison, right? And then the ones that they choose to run do not help you deal with the onslaught of being subjected to that, what I call mind-numbing experience of being locked up and under those conditions. So you have folks who are developing mental health issues or that are, if they already had it, it's being exacerbated, right? And if they didn't have it, now they're actually being exposed to having those issues. And these things go undiagnosed, right? Untreated. And now they're not even getting program services like education, whether there's GED access, what they're supposed to get is mandated, whether they're getting programs, which deals with their drug addiction, they're not getting any access to any of those under the guise and under the name of security.
And Tori, what we found also by looking at the data was really like if you are black or brown, you're much more likely to be in the maximum security prison. And if you're a white prisoner, you're much more likely to be in a pre-release or a minimum. And what there has been reports coming out that are just talking about the racism, the structural racism in the correction system that they've already found within, the world in general. And so these numbers are pretty stunning.
Yeah, you talked about this report that's going on you talked about a couple of reports, one that came out that showed a connection between people's race, age, and their educational status in determining their classification, whether or not they would be able to go into a lower sentence or less
lower security prison.
Lower security prison. Thank you. And then there's a new one coming out with the Department of Corrections and UMass Chan School, I think, that you talked about.
They just announced that they're doing this. They're actually, in one hand, the DOC said this is evidence-based classification, and then in the other hand, they said we're cooperating with the study to look at it and see if we can improve the system. So there are definitely an acknowledgement that there are problems within the system.
Right. I mean, they're going to do a review. Do you have any idea when?
It just started.
Okay, it just started now. Yep. Okay. I wonder, I mean, there's so much evidence to support this, and this isn't legal, right? I mean, the state has denied that this is the case. They said, like, that, you know, we have our classification protocol. It's for everyone's safety, right? But, like, through your work with Jamal, I mean, has it been frustrating? Do you feel like you're just banging your head against a wall?
Well, I feel like there's guys like myself that understands the process of coming out and what you need to do in order to kind of survive out here. But absent these spaces or individuals that are out here and folks that don't have that level of support at any sphere, they're basically forced to kind of figure that out, and that's what leads to the recidivism, because it's not easily designed for them to figure out where to access services at when they get out here. And then most of those services they're supposed to be getting just like an ID. They're supposed to get the major ID. Jamal just got out not even a month ago, and he didn't have an ID. You know, Kevin Kemp just got out not even a month ago, and still he didn't get an ID. But there was a bunch of money just given to the Department of Correction for that purpose, to strengthen that they come home with mass IDs or renewal of driver license and all that sort. So it's making the case that, much as what I've been saying the entire time, that black and brown folks, even though they're supposed to have access to these programs, they don't have access to them, not even at the medium facilities. And when they fight for those access, they're labeled as agitators, aggravators, you know, and then put in the hole unnecessarily, and then what type of message does that send?
Just retribution.
Mac can talk about that.
Yeah,
I his own personal story, but
yeah, I mean, what's your experience with that?
Well, I mean, I am someone that did a lot of avocation when I was in, and so, you know, for me, and that's why I always raised the question, what message does that send? If you give me a set of policies and practices and you say, hey, when you got a gripe, this is the way that you deal with it as part of a society. You got to keep in mind, even though prison is abnormal, it's supposed to be, or in many respects it is, a microcosm of what happens in the world at large. So if you're treating people in this way and you're teaching them that the rules and regulations don't apply, well, then that translates over when they get into the world, that those rules and regulations out here are arbitrary too. It's left to who's in power. And that's the wrong message if we're talking about the type of society that we're trying to build that's based on laws and justice.
You mentioned some of the funding. I think in your reporting, you said that $780 million in the state budget just for prisons. Some of the advocates that you spoke with, what do they think? They obviously think that money could be better spent elsewhere. What kind of programs would they like to see that spent on?
Well, I mean, when you look at the budget of the DOC, it continues to go up, except despite the fact that the population of the prisons has really dropped by half over the last 10 years. And there's just such a small percentage of the money that goes towards reentry programs, education. And so a lot of folks say, you know, the money really, there needs to be better amounts of money given to folks to help them reintegrate into society, to help educate them when they're there. And I also just wanted to say that you know, when I started doing this project, I said to Mac, where are these folks who are being released directly from maximum security to the street? And basically he said, on Mass and Cass, in you know, drugged out and high. He knows personally people who died by overdoses, or there was a recent case of a guy who is back in prison after killing a police officer in Rochester, New York. So the stories are really, they affect the public as well as the human beings who are being released.
Oh, they're committing suicide. Mm-hmm. You know, we just had someone that just killed himself recently. You know, a friend that I know by the name of Reese just killed himself, but having undergone these types of experiences in prison and not being able to treat these illnesses on their way out, this is what happens. They're forced to come out here and act like they're normal. You know, to act like what it is to be the standard of normal.
As if they were given a chance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to play this clip from one of your interviews with Jamal, where he just talked about kind of that jarring experience.
I never had a chance. I'd never been to a medium. You think that an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old should be in a maximum security prison with grown men?
No.
No. Think about that. You know what I'm saying? That your son's 19 years old, he makes a mistake. I didn't kill nobody.
I mean, this is like that. His case, you're saying, is extremely. This is not an outlier.
He
right?
did say, yeah, the lot of, like, he was like, yes, the fact that he was released, and he was released from the, what's it called, the secure SAU, which is actually even a more secure prison in the maximum security prison, where he was only allowed out to be put in a cage to walk around, or actually shackled to a table before he was released to the street. But he said, like, the biggest issue was his classification from the very beginning, where he was put in maximum security prison.
Yeah.
Which he shouldn't have been. But this is why, as part of the Racial Equity and Correction Initiative, we're trying to get this data bill collected, because there's not we know what's happening, but we need the data to support, to show that who's getting access and who's not getting access, right? And then we needed an oversight to actually get it passed with that bill as an enforcement mechanism, because the Department of Correction had already said that they can't police themselves. And they continue to say that by the way that they use the subjective views in doing things, in determining people's classifications. The classifications is based on objectiveness, meaning that it's set and designed to base and deal with people as they are, transforming themselves in the moment, in the time. But what the department does is it holds on to anything and everything that you ever done. Never mind, Jamal came back on the second sentence. He wasn't even on the previous sentence, and he got sent to the max because of that first sentence, which doesn't make no sense.
So they knew he had 2.5 years, and they put him in the max, where he really didn't have the opportunity to figure out how to make it out when he got out.
You mentioned the study that the DOC is kind of doing on themselves. Is there any legislation? Is there any other, obviously there's legal advocacy from smaller groups, but is there more of a push maybe from lawmakers or anything to make any kind of change in this area? Well,
I just spoke about the bill that's pending.
Yeah.
And in the public safety and also in the judiciary. And I think we already had at least a hearing in the judiciary. We have an upcoming hearing in public safety right now that's coming up. And we would urge everyone to reach out to their state legislators and to ask them, get that bill out of committee and put it up for a vote. We need this type of information. And this came out of the Structural Racism Commission as a recommendation that they couldn't even do their jobs because there wasn't enough data to support what they've already been hearing from anecdotal.
Need to get the data.
So,
okay.
Right.
Jenifer McKim, Mac Hudson, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Tori, for having us.
It's my pleasure.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Tori Bedford. Thanks for watching. Good night.